Hello, my brothers and sisters. This is the Remnant Warrior, and I want to welcome you guys for part 2 of our series exposing the Kabbalah and the wickedness associated with the Luciferian religion. Today, we are going to be listening to and watching a video clip from a newscast on why men like Jeffrey Epstein and other men of his character are able to go to Israel and receive safe haven. And we're going to hear about several people who this has occurred, several people who have gotten in trouble for this and have been able to go over there and seek safe haven. And then after we finish that video clip, we're going to be watching a video from Brother Benjamin Chárles from the Ben Born Again YouTube channel. And we played a video of his actually a clip of his video in part 1. And so he just came out with a brand new documentary series, and he just had part 1 come out, and we're going to play video from part 1 today, and we are going to be seeing why this absolute breakdown of morality is found in this religion, and how it's in this Luciferian system. The kingdom of Kabbalah is what it's going to be called for this video. We are going to see why morality in the kingdom of Kabbalah has completely broke down. And then once Ben's video is done playing, we are going to be watching another video clip of a report on things taking place over there that are quite shocking to hear, but they are real and they are happening. And the same moral breakdown that's causing the things from the first video that you're about to see, and the reasons for it are the same reasons behind the things taking place in the last video that we'll be watching after the video from Brother Benjamin Chárles. But for now, without any further ado, here is the news clip.
Sure.
It talks about how Israel's acted as a safe haven for Jewish pedophiles in the world. And obviously, just to be clear, non-Jews are pedophiles, in case there are any anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists out there. It acts as a safe haven for Jewish pedophiles and around the world, from the U.S. to Australia. You mentioned above Brett Ratner, and you report on how he, after being accused of rape and sexual misconduct by 10 women, fled to Israel for protection from prosecution, where you report he may be plotting a comeback to America under Trump. So what are the connections that you found between Epstein and Israel? And do you feel that Israel, and why has Israel acted, if you agree, why has Israel acted as a safe harbor for these serial abusers?
Well, so in the case of people like Ratner and people like Epstein, they're accused of major sex crimes, but they also have major connections to, organized crime and or intelligence, right? So I think, in their cases, part of it is motivated by, those other connections behind the scenes. Because if you consider, the early history of Israel, for example, some of these organized crime linked oligarchs we've discussed, the Bronfman family, for example, instrumental in arming the Haganah, the precursor to the IDF, for example. A lot of these, mob figures collaborated with Mossad, including Lansky himself in the 60s and 70s. Lansky and his illicit empire, intimately connected to not just early financial sources and resources for organized crime, like Tibor Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum was also a major funder of Mossad, right? Of early Mossad. And so a lot of these same figures, over time, I would really argue it's a transnational thing, but they have a lot of ties to Israeli intelligence and also to U.S. intelligence. You have figures like that I talk about in my book, for example, like Bruce Rappaport, who's sort of like this international banker based in Switzerland, but he also had a lot of ties to, Israeli intelligence activity, organized crime, was best friends with Bill Casey when he was CIA director and of course before, and that's how you sort of end up finding more often than not that in a lot of the CIA's most controversial activities, they're collaborating with, Israeli intelligence. And arguably that's because, they have connections that go even beyond those agencies. Because a lot of times when people talk about intelligence related crimes or covert operations, people forget that intelligence agencies aren't necessarily the power there. They work for somebody else. So oftentimes, as I note in my book, for example, in the case of the CIA, the CIA and its precursor, the OSS, were dominated by Wall Street bankers, and those bankers teamed up with organized crime. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, and the CIA ended up taking over a lot of rackets from the mob, like drug trafficking, because, the mob then, by teaming up with the CIA, gets state protection. A lot of, people that were used in assassination efforts backed by the CIA hired mobsters from the US to do that. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between them, and you arguably, follow it long enough, you can't really tell where one ends and one begins. But, most of the CIA's regime change coups were done on behalf of U.S. multinational corporations and because of, oligarch moneyed interests in the U.S. And it makes sense when you consider that most of them originally, were Wall Street bankers or from, elite families and had interests in these multinational corporations and all of that. So, it's important, and this is, something I tried to show in my book, is that there's structures behind these intelligence agencies. And when, I think it's important, again, to look at the layer, behind either, these Israel as a government or the US as a government or the CIA or Mossad or Israeli intelligence, and realize that there's, been more uniting these different factions and groups that kind of goes on in these other realms. And as far as, since you asked about Epstein and the Israeli state, and I kind of got off on a tangent there. He's really alleged to have been working more closely with Israeli military intelligence, not necessarily Mossad. And this comes from people that, were in Israeli military intelligence that worked with him. Of course, his affiliation with the Maxwell family, who are known to have been Israeli intelligence assets, and not just Robert Maxwell, but also, some of his children. Obviously, Ghislaine is, of course, suspected of that. But her sister, who is a big Silicon Valley figure in both the U.S. and Israel, very close to, former heads of Mossad, Shimon Peres, former prime ministers, a lot of powerful connections, allegedly inherited her father's contacts in that orbit, developed very close ties to Bill Gates in the 1990s, who later, of course, becomes a big Epstein associate, and a lot of other interesting wrinkles there, I guess you could say. And then, of course, there's the case of, Epstein when he was evading charges. He went to Israel to attempt to evade charges, which is actually, I would call it the Lansky model. It's something Mayor Lansky tried to do. Not necessarily for sex charges. In Lansky's case, it was tax evasion, but he didn't want to be prosecuted, so he immigrated to Israel until he was basically assured he wouldn't get in trouble, and then comes back and the charges kind of, disappear. And so with Epstein, he, went abroad and didn't come back until his sweetheart deal had been hammered out by people like Alan Dershowitz. But at the time he was, waiting abroad, he was, according to local reports in like Palm Beach, the Palm Beach Post, for example, Epstein was touring military bases in Israel. So that's kind of interesting. If you're just a regular guy charged with a crime in another country, and you're going to go visit another country and tour their military bases, doesn't really make a lot of sense unless there was some other, notable connection there. And it's worth pointing to that, Leslie Wexner in particular, through his foundations, has had a lot of ties to Israeli government officials. He has, the Wexner Foundation has whole fellowships dedicated to training people that go into Israeli public service. And also, he's been in negotiations on and off, not recently, but I think back in the 90s and 80s about, setting up ventures in the occupied Golan Heights, for example, in, direct connection with Israel's government and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting overlaps, to say the least. But I don't really necessarily argue that Epstein was exclusively Israeli intelligence. I think he was tied to this network I've been sort of trying to suss out here, that involves, organized crime and intelligence and these oligarch figures, private capital, and was ultimately working on behalf of that group that obviously necessitates ties to all of those elements, right? But ultimately, I think, the network he was working for wasn't exclusive to a particular intelligence agency.
It is important to know that modern rabbinical Judaism is not the same religion of the Hebrew Israelites found in the Old Testament. Most Christians think that Judaism is merely the practice of the Old Testament Mosaic law, but the truth is that it's a completely unrecognizable religion with many added rabbinical texts to their canon that they call the Torah. Most Christians think that the term Torah means the first 5 books of Moses, but in rabbinical Judaism, the term Torah also includes the Babylonian Talmud as well as the writings of the Kabbalah, like the Zohar, which is Jewish luciferianism. In the modern Hebrew language, the word Torah simply means instructions, which to the Jews includes the instructions of the rabbis found in the Talmud and Kabbalah. The Jewish Babylonian Talmud not only rejects Jesus as the Messiah, but has incredibly hateful things to say about the Lord and Savior. So blasphemous that it grieves my soul to even speak this out loud, but it's vital we learn the truth about rabbinical Judaism.
Rabbi, what are those books behind you? Hi, my name is Rabbi Raps. I teach you what you should have learned in Hebrew school, and people always want to know, what are those books? And those are the Talmud, the most fascinating set of books, I believe, in the world. Over 15,000 pages, written over 500 years, quoting over 500 different rabbis, talking about all areas of Jewish life. This is the most misunderstood book. I get so much hate mail about things the Talmud says. Why don't we actually study the Talmud?
Yes, let's study the Talmud. The Jewish Babylonian Talmud is available to read online at sefaria.org. I first want to bring your attention to Yevamot 63a, where we read, "And Rabbi Elazar said, 'What is the meaning of that which is written? This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh.'" Genesis 2:23. This teaches that Adam had intercourse with each animal and beast.
Adam had intercourse with each animal and beast
in his search for his mate, and his mind was not at ease, in accordance with the verse, "And for Adam there was not found a helpmate for him," Genesis 2:20, until he had intercourse with Eve. The Talmud contains dialogue of high-profile rabbis who banter back and forth about legalistic details regarding the most vile sexual acts. Disturbingly, there's endless dialogue about bestiality, where the rabbis nitpick on details about whether or not to also kill the animals who have been raped by Jews, or if they are also guilty of seduction. But it gets even more satanic than that. As you read through the Talmud, you learn that rabbis cling to the age of 3-year-old little girls as a special number. Let's scroll to Ketubot 11b, where we read, "Rava said that this is what the Mishnah is saying. An adult man who has engaged in intercourse with a minor girl less than 3 years old has done nothing, as intercourse with a girl less than 3 years old is tantamount to poking a finger into the eye. In the case of an eye, after a tear falls from it, another tear forms to replace it. Similarly, the ruptured hymen of the girl younger than 3 is restored." To further validate this teaching, we read in Yevamot 57b, "We too learn in the following Bereta that there is no legal significance to an act of intercourse with a girl less than 3 years old." And then it goes on to say that a girl 3 years and 1 day old can be betrothed via sexual intercourse. As we read through these vile and satanic scriptures of the so-called Jewish Torah, I can't help but think of false teacher Paula White, President Trump's faith advisor, as she was quoted in the Jerusalem Post saying, "Christians must learn from Jews, not convert them." The article goes on to say that Paula is now studying Torah with Orthodox Jews in Israel. Gittin 57a verses 3 through 4, that a sorcerer named Onkelos raised Jesus Christ from the dead using witchcraft. And Jesus even tells Onkelos himself that he is in hell boiling in hot feces. Onkelos then went and raised Jesus the Nazarene from the grave through necromancy. Onkelos said to him, "Who is most important in that world where you are now?" Jesus said to him, "The Jewish people." Onkelos asked him, "Should I then attach myself to them in this world?" Jesus said to him, "Their welfare you shall seek, their misfortune you shall not seek. for anyone who touches them is regarded as if he were touching the apple of his eye. Angelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Jesus himself. In the next world, Jesus said to him, "He is punished with boiling excrement." As a master said, anyone who mocks the words of the sages will be sentenced to boiling excrement. And this was his sin, as he mocked the words of the sages. The Jewish scriptures tell us that they believe Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, is actually in hell boiling in poop and can be summoned through witchcraft by such necromancers named Angelos.
There are hundreds, if not thousands, of videos of beheaded Palestinian babies and children, Palestinian children with severed limbs, killed by Israel. And not a single corporate media outlet has reported on how Israel has systematically beheaded Palestinian children on a daily basis for the last 15 months. And yet every single one of these Western media outlets was so quick to spread the mass atrocity propaganda in order to manufacture consent for Israel's genocide by repeating a story about an incident which never took place.
We have some really disturbing new information out of Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
I choked up earlier reading this new revelation about 40 babies being killed.
Oh my God.
And some of them being beheaded. And I was like, how can any human being do that to a baby?
So what message does that send? That mythical beheaded babies, because they were Israeli, are to be reported on when the incident never happened. But that Palestinian babies and children, when they're beheaded and their limbs are severed and they're found hanging from trees with half of their body missing, that they are not worth the coverage to report on their experience, on their premature death at the hands of Israel and the United States. Did you know that Israeli occupation forces tied explosives to the body of an 80-year-old Palestinian man who was forced to clear booby-trapped houses, and once they released him, they shot and killed him and his wife? Did you know that Israeli soldiers were captured on film raping a Palestinian hostage? And when news of this came to light, Israeli far-right politicians and soldiers and ordinary people protested outside of the facility where the soldier was being held, demanding that he be released. And in parallel, the Israeli Knesset engaged in debates on the right of Israeli soldiers to rape Palestinian hostages.
שיש מי שבפרקליטות חושב שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. אנחנו לא יכולים להמשיך כרגיל. להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי? כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות. אוקיי, הכל.
One of the soldiers who was involved in the rape had a media tour all around Israeli media stations and took off his ski mask and was revered as a national hero by members of Israeli society. Did you know that a young Palestinian boy by the name of Saddam Rajab was killed in the occupied West Bank after an Israeli occupation soldier shot him in the stomach? Even though the evidence is right there, it was still responded to by supporters of Israel as being fake or being what they call Pallywood. Because not only does Israel kill Palestinians with impunity, but Israel's supporters, to believe that their ideology is morally justified, when they do see images of Israel's policies against Palestinians, they just claim that they're fake, that they didn't happen, that they're made up entirely by Palestinians to claim global sympathy. Did you know that Israeli occupation forces recently killed a 2-year-old Palestinian girl by the name of Al-Khatib, who was sitting down to eat dinner with her family in occupied Jenin? She was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper. Not only did the Israeli sniper shoot her, but then the Israeli occupation forces prevented her and her family from rushing to get medical care, and she died. This, of course, is not an aberration. This happens all the time on a daily basis prior to October 7th.
This is a little controversial because a lot of people want to deny this happened, but the first pope was actually a Jewish scholar. And this first pope, who was this great scholar, he was not a pope, he was a rabbi living in Jaffa. And the Jews were being terribly hassled by the early Christians who were hanging around Israel. And he had an idea. He says, if you give me permission, he went to the sages, he said, if you give me permission, I would like to go to the temple and ask the Kohanim for certain names of God that only they're allowed to use, and I will use them, create miracles, get all the Christians excited about it, and then move them out of Israel. And he says, but I'll do it under one condition, that the punishment for doing such a thing will fall on all of us. I don't want to take all the blame. Meaning I'll be the fall guy, but we're sharing the punishment from heaven for using the names of God for this. And they agreed. He went to the temple and he got the names from the Kohanim, and he started doing acts of wonders for the early Christians. And when they all got rallied behind him, he says, we're moving to Rome. And everyone's like, what? And he says, that's right. It's the word of God. We're moving to Rome. And all the early Christians were like, Rome it is. We're with Bozo. And they all went to Rome. This was 2,000 years ago. Time of the beginning of Christianity. And they moved to Rome, and he became known as first pope.
The most famous crypto-Jew in history was their self-proclaimed Messiah of 1666. Sabbatai Zevi, a Kabbalah rabbi, declared himself the Jewish Messiah in the year 1666 and convinced literally half of the world's Jewish population at the time, over 1 million Jews, to follow him into the twisted world of luciferianism through the practice of Kabbalah. Zevi forged a new foundation of Judaism that preached redemption through sin, which consisted of inverting everything sacred and pure into degenerate acts of perversion and depravity as a form of spiritual liberation and personal deification. The practices that the Sabbateans promoted most were things like wife swapping, incestuous pedophilia, group orgies, bestiality, and debauchery, among many other things. In 1666, Sabbatai Zevi visited Constantinople, where he was imprisoned and given the choice of either facing death or conversion to Islam, ordered by the Sultan Mehmed IV. Zevi chose to convert to Islam, sporting a turban from then on. He was praised and financially rewarded in the Ottoman Empire for his conversion. A large portion of his devout followers also converted to Islam and became known as the Donme, which is Turkish for converts. Zevi took being a crypto-Jew to a whole new level, beginning with the Islamic Donme sect in Turkey, which inspired a major crypto-Jew movement of infiltration and hijacking of other major religious and world government leadership positions, while secretly remaining Kabbalistic Jews. In the mid-1700s, Kabbalah rabbi Jacob Frank was Sabbatai Zevi's successor, who claimed to be the reincarnation of not only Sabbatai Zevi himself, but also the biblical patriarch Jacob, who later was known as Israel in the Bible. Jacob Frank took redemption through sin into even more depraved and satanic depths that included ritual human and child sacrifice. Jacob Frank preached a Gnostic philosophy wherein there was a true God, who is the God of Kabbalah, who Christians would call Satan or Lucifer. This God of Kabbalah was hidden by a false God, who in reality is really the true God of the Bible, Jesus Christ. Frank taught that the God of Kabbalah could be revealed only through a total destruction of the social and religious structures created by the false God. His millions of followers are called Sabbatean Frankists to this day. Jacob Frank partnered with none other than the satanic bloodline of Mayer Amschel Rothschild and Illuminati Jesuit Adam Weishaupt to form a purely satanic and Kabbalistic unholy trinity that would soon infiltrate and hijack world banking and the upper levels of Judaism, Catholicism, and Islam.